We will get started. So calling the meeting together. It's a special council meeting for the City of Owen Sound, February 21st, 2019. Again, it's just after 7 p.m. Disclosure pecuniary interest. Does anyone have any pecuniary interest that they need to declare? Seeing none. Motion to move council into committee of the whole.
Moved by myself, Councillor Gregg, seconded by Councillor Hamley, that City Council now go into Committee of the Whole to consider staff presentations related to fire arbitration.
And all in favor? And that is carried. Now we're down to number 4. Maybe go to you, Mr. Ritchie, if you want to do the song and dance and fill in the blanks.
I will. I don't have to song and dance for long, Your Worship. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce John Saunders, the Senior Labour and Employment Lawyer with Hicks Morley, and John's going to be discussing staffing, risk assessment, needs and circumstances with regards to Owen Sound Fire Services and the Owen Sound Professional Firefighters Association. He's joined this evening by Andy McDonald. Many of you will remember Andy from KCB Management Consulting. He provided our Fire Services Assessment Report. And they will be also joined this evening by Michael Clark, our Deputy Fire Chief. So I welcome them here. I would ask during the presentation if you could hold questions until the end. They certainly have all evening to spend with us if that's what Council desires. But it's probably going to flow a little more smoothly if you note your questions and ask them all at the end. So with that, over to you, John.
I'll use the mouse. Oh, no, use that. That's fine. Thanks. Thank you. Two things. We have the PowerPoint presentation, and then we just gave out a chart that shows all of the comparable municipalities with regard to populations to Owen Sound. Now, we shouldn't have handed it out. You're going to spend the whole night reading that and not paying attention here. So we'll get to it, and you can come through it, and I'll clearly walk you through it in great detail. So thank you for allowing me the opportunity to come to present. I just wanted to review where we have been and where we are going.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman, just generally. Mr. Saunders, I'm new to council, and a couple of us are new to council as well, so if you could just indulge me. You're a lawyer, you're our lawyer as the city, correct?
Yes, correct.
And what is the intent to your presentation today? Are you seeking instructions from us as council as you enter arbitration? Could you just set the parameters
Sure.
to the point of this meeting? Thank you.
Let me just step back. So I'm a labor lawyer. I'm a partner at the law firm of Hicks Morley in Toronto. We're a group of 123 lawyers. All we do is management side labor law. So we only represent employers against employees and unions. If you want to know about tax, real estate, corporate, commercial, wills, family, criminal, don't ask me, I have no clue. Labor law, that's all I do. The vast majority of my practice is representing municipalities with regard to their fire departments, EMS, and a little bit of police. And I've done interest arbitrations for the last 32 years, both in Ontario and across the province. And across the country in various forums. We have been engaged in the City of Owen Sound interest arbitration. This has been a long-standing process, and we are right now in the middle of that interest arbitration. And what I would like tonight, hopefully, is to have a motion of support with regard to the position that we are taking at the interest arbitration. So we're right in the middle of the interest arbitration. We're going to give you some facts, and then at the end of the evening, I would hope that one of you might see fit to move a motion in support of your fire department and the plan that they're taking forward at the interest arbitration. And the reason I say that is to cut right to the chase, is under the Fire Prevention and Protection Act, the piece of legislation that deals with the fire department, and in particular the labor relations dealing with the fire department, it specifically says that council decides the needs and circumstances in your community. So you decide whether you want to spend $10 million or $100 million on your fire department. And you can have a fire station on every block, or you can have one fire station, which is what you have right now. There is no doubt within any fire department, more is always better. 2 stations will be better than 1 station. 3 stations will be better than 1 station. But the question is, at the end of the day, you have limited budget, limited resources, and the question becomes, what is the additional oomph that you're getting for the money that you're paying for, and are there better, more efficient ways to be spending your money, allocating your money, and do you need to have the staffing that you currently have? And I'm going to take you through what you have and what the proposal is. So just to walk back through and sort of give a little quick bit of history, your old fire collective agreement expired December 31st of 2014, and the interest arbitration that gave rise to that took place for a long period of time. I'm not going to waste your time getting into that, but the interest arbitration for the next collective agreement that starts in 2015, the hearing dates were held in October and November of 2018. All of the issues were put in front of the Board of Arbitration. It's a three-person Board of Arbitration, and there's only one issue that's remaining that we're putting the evidence forward on behalf of the municipality. And we booked a series of dates that are going to take place in March and April for those, so that we can put forward the evidence that we're going to talk about tonight, and that we can call the various experts, one for our side, one for the association side, to give their views in terms of whether or not the proposal that we're putting forward or the proposal that the association is putting forward is appropriate for the City of Owen Sound. So let's talk about what those are. So right now, under your collective agreement, you have what's called a minimum staffing clause. And what that says is that you guarantee, pursuant to your collective agreement, that there shall always be a minimum of 5 full-time firefighters on duty 24/7. And so those 5 full-time firefighters are made up of a captain and what we'll call force suppression firefighters. So that can be first class, second class, third class, fourth class. So 5 is the minimum right now. Right now, you staff, if everyone were to show up, at 6. So just so you understand the numbers, the fire department has 4 platoons, so you use the 4 platoons to provide staffing 24/7. Okay, so 4 platoons, and each platoon has 6 individuals on that platoon. So in total, you have 24 full-time suppression firefighters. In addition to that, you have 2 what are called floaters. And the floaters float back and forth. Each floater is assigned to 2 platoons. And so we assign that floater based on whether or not we need that person on this platoon or that platoon because someone's on vacation or on a lieu day or sick or on WSIB, etc. We'll get into a little bit more in terms of that staffing. Okay? So you have 6 if everyone shows up, and that never happens, and I'll show you why that is. 6 per platoon. 1 captain, 5 firefighters, but your minimum staffing, 1 captain, 4 firefighters for a total of 5. Okay? That's what you have under your collective agreement. Now, most municipalities do not have a minimum staffing clause in their collective agreement. So, for example, if you look at the little chart that was handed out, and again, I don't want you to get sidetracked on this, but just to show you what it is, we've listed these municipalities by population, and so we start with the ones that are larger down to the smaller. Owen Sound, as you're aware, has 21,000 for population. So what we did was we essentially doubled that, took it up to about 45, which is Whitchurch Stouffville, all the way down to the last one on the bottom of the 3rd page, which is Hawkesbury at 10. So we went from double to half. And we've listed all the municipalities in between. And so we've listed their population, and then we've listed whether or not they're a composite department. So just to remind you, firefighters, fire protection services are provided one of 2 ways, by full-time firefighters, which is what you have. The average full-time firefighter cost is about $140,000 per individual. Okay? $140,000, that's all in. You get benefits, you get 369, you get a little overtime, that's your salary. Conversely, you can have volunteer firefighters, and the cost for a volunteer firefighter, depending on how they're compensated, is somewhere between $2,000 to maybe $4,000 to $5,000 per firefighter per year. So it's substantially less. So if you have a department that is serviced by both full-timers and volunteers, it's called a composite department. So what you'll see is that many of the municipalities that are comparable have composite fire departments. You have a number of stations, so you only have one station, Inner Township, which is the the municipality that surrounds you. I think you are unique, certainly in Ontario, in my experience, you're unique in that Inner Township has their station in your municipality. It's like the weirdest thing I've ever heard of, frankly. We're not here to discuss what you're going to do with Inner Township. That's a discussion for another night. We've listed the number of full-time/volunteers in each of those departments, and more importantly, we've listed the minimum number of suppression firefighters that they run with. But what you'll see, and importantly, is in the second last column, it talks about is minimum staffing per platoon part of the collective agreement. And what you'll see in many situations, frankly in most, it is not part of the collective agreement. It is simply a policy of the municipality, and so council and or the fire chief can change that policy at their whim. You cannot, because it's baked right into your collective agreement. You have to get it changed through interest arbitration, because your full-time fire association will never decrease that number, guaranteed. Okay, that will never be negotiated down. So that's why we're at interest arbitration right now. So, going back to first principles, minimum staffing of 5, captain and 4 firefighters. That's your first in the collective agreement mandatory number. The second number that's in your collective agreement is that there is a guaranteed staff complement of a total of 26 firefighters. Okay, that's 26 suppression, and that's what you have right now. Okay, you remember 4 platoons, 6 per platoon, that's 24, plus 2 floaters equals 26. And you also have fire prevention, blah, blah, blah. We're not going to worry about that. So we're not suggesting any change to the total number of full-time firefighters that are in your department. The change that's being suggested is, if I go back to the first slide that we just looked at, is to say that we would change the minimum staffing number from 5 to 4. And so what that would mean is that your minimum staff would be, instead of 1 captain plus 4 firefighters, it would be 1 captain plus 3 firefighters. That's what we're suggesting. The association, on the other hand, is saying, no, no, leave this language the way it is, and they want to change the 26 number to 28. So what we have is we have 2 competing propositions or proposals before the Board of Interest Arbitration. So we say drop the numbers, they say raise the numbers. So we need to be able to convince the interest arbitrator that we have the case to support that in terms of that. So, and you know, the easy thing for the interest arbitrator, let's be blunt, is to say, now you both lose, we leave it the way it is. We don't want that, and that's why we have put forward what I think is a fairly compelling case. Well, I guarantee you're going to win? Not a chance with regard to that. Let's be blunt here in terms of that. Will they get their number increased? I suspect not, but we're going to see. And we're going to show you why we think we have a half-decent chance of being successful in this. So the first question is, well, why the heck are you doing this in the first place? Well, the answer is, under the BMA study statistics, you pay the second highest per capita rate for all municipalities under 30,000 population for fire services. Let's just let that bake in for a minute. The actual chart, we've listed a number of the municipalities here that we have for comparative purposes. The actual number of municipalities under 30,000 is about 5 times the size of this list. I just didn't want to fit them all on the slide. Brockville is higher than you are, but everybody else is substantially lower. So if you were to look, I just pulled Meaford off because it's just around the corner and part of Inner Township. They spend per capita $70 for their fire services. They're total volunteer. Owen Sound is composite, Collingwood's composite, Thorold's composite, same for Kenora, East Gwillimbury, Elliott Lake, and Port Colborne. So only you and Brockville are just full-time. So, and frankly, that's why you're the highest and the second highest costs per capita for your fire departments. And so we say, strictly on a monetary or financial basis, there's a demonstrated need for you to lower your costs of providing fire services in this community. So let's go back and say, okay, how do you actually respond to fires? Because you are actually unique in the province of Ontario in terms of how you do this. You recall I talked about a composite department before, which is a combination of full-timers and volunteers. You actually have a third group. You have paid standby individuals who sit in the middle of that group. So right now, you have either 5 or 6 people, full-timers on duty 24/7. Those are your paid full-timers. Minimum 5. If everybody showed up, it'd be 6. So they're there. They can always respond out to a call. The second line of defense is you pay your full-timers just over $2,000 a year to be on standby. And what that means is that on a rotational basis, each of the different platoons is on standby for a set period of time, for a tour. We don't need to get into the logistics of it, but they are paid to carry a pager, and they have to come in on a reasonable time frame. So we haven't actually set a time, a reasonable time frame fit for duty. So when these people are on standby, they're not drinking, they're not down in Toronto at the boat show, they're not up at their camp in Northern Ontario. They can respond in a reasonable time, and they're fit for duty. And so we know that if we call these people, we have 5 fully qualified, trained, full-time firefighters who will respond. Other municipalities do not have that, okay? There are a couple of places where they have firefighters on standby, but you're a little different because you have full-timers, standby, and then we're going to get to the volunteers at the very end, which are from Inter Township. The third thing that you have, if we need more people, is we then call back all of the other firefighters. So there's a total of 26 firefighters. 5 or 6 are actually on duty. 5 are on standby, but that leaves a whole bunch of other people who are neither on duty or nor on standby. Those people we will call as well in certain circumstances. That's called a third alarm if we need them. So they get called or paged out, and some of them will come. No obligation for those people to come. If they've been drinking, if they're off at their cottage and are not available, they don't show up. The 5 standby people, they have to show up. So that's the third line of defense. And then the fourth line of defense is that we call the inter-township volunteers. So if we've gone through the first 3 and we need more, we call the inter-township volunteers. Now, all of these decisions in terms of who to call are set up in protocols, but essentially it's the dispatcher and it's the incident commander or captain who's on duty that decides who and when people are called. So if the call comes into dispatch and says the hospital is on fire, you can guarantee that all 4 groups will be called out instantaneously. If the call is it's a medical assist call, well, they're only going to send 3 firefighters and a pumper. They're not even going to send the full crew, because all we do is we send out 3 firefighters and a pumper on a medical assist call. Okay, so it depends on what the call is. And sometimes we're called out on a medical assist call and they arrive and there's a pot in the stove that's burning. They go, whoa, we need some more people. They get in the call, they call more people. So things can be upgraded in the middle of the call depending on the special circumstances. And it's the incident commander or the captain that decides what those circumstances are and whether or not he thinks that they should be called out. I'm going to keep using the word he because we only have males within the Owen Sound Fire Department. So that's the story there. All we're proposing to do is to change that call-out procedure in one way, and that's to say that the first line, instead of having 5 or 6, could have 4, 5, or 6. Because of the minimum staffing number at 26, we still could have 5 on duty to the same degree we have now, or even 6 on duty to the same degree we have on now. But what the problem is now is that when we have a whole bunch of people call in sick or not available on a platoon and the floater's already been assigned, we're calling people back on overtime. And we're having to pay gobs of overtime. We'll get to those numbers, okay? That's the challenge. All we're trying to do is to cut down on the overtime usage. So that's all we're saying. The call out, the sources of firefighters remains identical, except we now have 4 instead of 4, 5, 6 instead of 5, 6. So let's talk about why we need this. So right now, under your collective agreement, if you add up the number of shifts of vacation, your firefighters are legally entitled to vacation. They take that vacation, as they should. I'm not being negative in terms of that. They take, on average, 525 shifts per year of vacation. Okay, so that's, somebody added that up and gave me that number. In total, they also get 12 lieu days. Those are the stat holiday days. So each of them get 12. There's 26. 26 times 12, 312 of those. So we add those up, you get 837. These are guaranteed times that people will take off during the year. We divide that by 4 because there's 4 platoons. So we have about 200 shifts per platoon that have to be taken off. This is before we even get into sickness in terms of this. So you'll recall that one firefighter, if they were to work every day, they're assigned to 182 shifts in a year because they work 10-hour days, 14-hour nights, average of 12 hours. So one firefighter equals 182 shifts. So what you'll see is that if the platoon has to have 209 shifts off, what that means is that 6th firefighter, by definition, is eaten up having vacation days and lieu days per year. Okay, everybody with me on that? So you automatically, except in extreme circumstances, that 6th firefighter is always booked off every day. Okay, what they do is they do their vacation selections in November of each year, and they go through based on seniority and a bunch of other factors, and they pick. And you can't pick 2 at the same time. You pick 1. And so they get spread out throughout the year. So we burn through the 6th person simply based essentially on the vacation and lieu days. Then, regretfully, we have STD, short-term disability, long-term disability, and WSIB. And unfortunately, over the last few years, we've had a series of individuals who've been off for extended periods of time. And what you'll see is the statistics here. And you'll see that especially in 2016 and 2017, the numbers spiked, especially with regard to the LTD and the WSIB, because we had people off for a variety of reasons. And I'm not here to be negative or critical of that. These are people who are off with legitimate medical illnesses, and we're not saying anything about that. But the reality is those people need to be replaced. So if we add up in each of the years how many shifts are lost, you'll see that between 15 and 18, it ranges from about 220 up to over 600 shifts per year that are off. Now, this also doesn't include bereavement leave, union duty, a whole series of other jury duty. There's a whole series of other times that people are off, again, for quite legitimate reasons. But we just picked the 3 big ones, if I can put it that way, for illustration purposes. So if you average those 4 years, you come up to about 400 per year, 400 shifts a year that people are going to be off. Divide by the 4 platoons, you get another 100 days per platoon that people are going to be off for STD, LTD, WSIB. So you add the vacation and the lieu time plus that, you get about 300 shifts a year. So how do we deal with those? Well, as I said before, the 6th person covers off the first 182 shifts. Now, we can get into the real tricky math here because the 6th person actually has their own vacation and lieu days too, so they don't actually work 182 days, but we've sort of calculated that because we added that in the first set of numbers, so ignore that. 6th person covers 182. We have floaters, so we have 2 floaters, and the floaters alternate between 2 platoons, so each platoon has half a floater. So half a floater gives you 91 shifts. So we have the 6th person plus the floater. So we add those up, we subtract from the 300, and you say, oh, we only have 26 shifts actually that need to be covered. If everything works out just hunky-dory, thank you very much. But the reality is our world and your world does not work that way. It's not perfect, and the people that are off on WSIB and STD and LTD are not evenly distributed amongst all of the platoons, and they don't call in, 6 weeks in advance so that we can pre-plan. And some of them we do know we're going to have for extended periods of time. The result is that in 2017, for example, you spent $181,000 in overtime calling back full-time firefighters just to achieve the minimum number of 5. The number for 2018 is substantially lower, and I think it's about 80, 90, something. I don't, 89,000. So it's substantially less in 2018, and just so you understand why that is, oops, sorry, wrong way. If you just go back to those statistics, what you'll see is in 2018, we lost way fewer shifts, mostly due to LTD and the WSIB. But the answer is, and the problem is it's not predictable. So if I had a crystal ball, I could predict when people will be off and when someone will be injured or when somebody will have to go off on LTD, but I can't do that. So these are the numbers. We didn't put the 2018 numbers in. These are the hours per year that you've had to cover off to backfill that 5th position on overtime. So what you'll see, frankly, for the last 4 years, ignoring 2018, it averages up about 2.5, almost up to 3, 2,800 hours per year. And again, those numbers could go up or down. And frankly, we'd be ecstatic if they went down. But I don't think we can predict that. And if the future is reflected by the past, this is your past that reflects that. So let's step back and say, okay, well, what do we really respond to as part of the Owen Sound Fire Department, and how are these people actually being used? We call it a fire department, but in reality, our fire calls are quite minimal. Okay? Now, I want to be clear. Firefighters are sitting around for the vast majority of their day, but they're sitting in a state of readiness. Okay, so when we look first off at the totals across the bottom of that page, a couple of things you'll observe quite quickly. One is that the numbers are decreasing. I can tell you that the 2018 numbers, the total numbers, are 809. So you'll see that the number for 2018 is really low. Okay, and again, that could change tomorrow, so we're not predicting anything. But the trend line is certainly down. And the first thing you'll note is that in 2011, there was a huge drop to 2012, and that was as a result of the change in the dispatch protocol for medical assists. So if you look at the second line from the bottom, you'll see that in 2011 you did 755 medical assists, and that number has now dropped dramatically to 366 to about 400 and 450. And so, because frankly, the decision was made that there isn't a lot of value add to be sending a pumper and 3 firefighters to certain type of medical calls. And again, that's no disrespect to your firefighters, but the paramedics have the higher qualifications with regard to medical responsibilities than the firefighters. And a decision was made by your chief of the day that we don't need to be using our resources, they can be better utilized otherwise. So that has fundamentally decreased your call volume. So you'll see the whole series of calls. The ones that sort of jump out are the 2 in the middle, which are the false fire calls and the CO, carbon monoxide false calls. Now let's just pause on that. You only know it's a false call when you've been there, okay, and said, oh, it's a false call. When you're going there, you don't know if it's a false call or not. So you go there, lights and sirens, and it's only after the fact that you can say, oh, it's a false call. So it's not to say, oh, well, we kind of meandered down the street because we knew it was a false call. The reality is we go anticipating that it is something that's not good. And the other thing that you'll see is that as the numbers tail down, that is a complement to your fire prevention and education component of your fire response. Okay? You have people with more smoke detectors, more people that are being aware of what they should and shouldn't be doing. You're doing more to deal with, dare I say, the hoarders within the community and things of that nature that are creating fire hazards. So anyway, those are your statistics, but what you'll see is fire calls actually are relatively a small number of your actual calls. The other question is, well, who do we send to those calls? So if we're sitting down and looking at it, these are the 2017 numbers. And what this shows, the same breakdown of calls that if you look across the bottom, you'll see that often we're sending, sorry, let me go through the columns first. The response number is the same as what you looked at before. So it's 908, just to take it back for 908 is the total call volume in the bottom right-hand corner for 2017, total call volume. So you go to here, same number of call volumes, but in 60% of the calls, you sent 3 or fewer firefighters. So you didn't need to send everyone that you had, because remember, you have 5 sitting in the station. 60% of your calls, you only sent 3 or less. 13% you sent 4, and 26% you sent 5 or more. Now, 5 or more means you sent everyone that was there, and or you called in. I'll show you what that means in a second, okay? So on 26% of your calls, you sent 5 people. Oops. Why is this? Oh, there we go. The question is, how many times did you actually need more than 5 people? And this is the statistic here. So how many times did you have a second alarm call? Because the reality is, when you need 5, you need 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. It's not that the 5th person is the be-all or the end-all. If you need 5, you need way more than 5, okay? And so that's measured by how many times you actually needed a second or third alarm call. So you remember, second alarms are where we call the 5 standby individuals. So in each of the last 3 years, it varied about, averaging about 22, okay, per year, that there was times when you needed that second alarm. And then what I had the chief go through is to say, look, let's look at the call itself, and did you actually need those additional 5 people, or did we just call them out of an abundance of caution? And this isn't meant to be critical in any way, shape, or form to the incident commander or the captain who made that decision to call those people in. They're encouraged. If you think you need more, you call them. Okay, we're not trying to save money by saying, oh, well, let's hold back and we'll see. If you think you need them, they have total ability and freedom to call whatever resources in they feel are effective in terms of that. So the chief went through and said the second alarm was required on 12, 7, and 5 and 4 times in those years. And then the question is, how many times did it become a third alarm call, which is where you're calling in the other full-timers who are not scheduled or not on standby? And the protocol within the city of Owen Sound is, if we call a third alarm, we actually call inter-township as well. So on a third alarm, we call everyone else who's out there in terms of the full-timers, and we call inter-township. That happened 4 times in the last 3 years. And those were the big ones, okay? And all 4 of those were the big fires, okay? And when we called inter-township, in every situation they responded, and they responded with over 20 firefighters. And so they responded well. And frankly, their response time, again, given where they are geographically located, was helpful. Part of our challenge, of course, is our full-time firefighters, 75% of them live outside the city. So their response time is going to be a little slower than it will be for people who live inside the city. The other thing to remember as well is that on these response calls, in addition to all of the firefighters that we've talked about, the chief and the deputy respond as well. One of the 2 of them are always on call 24/7, okay? And often they both respond because they're both here. So right now, Doug is down south on vacation. Mike's on call 24/7 all of this week and the whole time period. And he will respond certainly for every second alarm call and probably some of the other ones if he thinks it's appropriate. So there actually is a, quote, other person who's showing up. Now, I don't want to get into a work of the bargaining unit to say, well, they shouldn't be doing the full-timers' work, blah, blah, blah. We'll just leave that to the side in terms of that. But let's just say your chief and your deputy have full bunker gear in their personal vehicles. They show up. Mike lives around the corner from here. He's going to show up, and he will do what needs to be done. We'll just leave it at that, and we'll leave the grievances if we ever get any. We haven't. So it has not been a problem or a concern. So that's what happens there. So there is another individual that's sort of in the mix that we don't count, if I can put it that way. So the association proposal is to say, you'll recall if you go back, they want to go from a minimum of 26 to a minimum of 28. Each of your full-time firefighters, and this is costed at the first-class firefighter level. They will say, oh, but you hire them as probationary or fourth class. They only cost you 60% of a first-class firefighter. But the reality is it goes up 10% a year until they get to become first class. So you cost these at first class. And most of you who've been around council for a while will understand 369. For the newbies on council, what that means is that if you have been a firefighter for 17 or 23 years, you get an extra 3, 6, or 9%. So if you're a firefighter with, first-class firefighter with 23 years of service, you get an additional 9% worth of money. So anyway, your benefit cost runs about 30% on your gross base, and your firefighters now are being paid $89, but that's your 2014 rate. They will be paid shortly over $100,000 a year, base pay. And you'll get 369 on top of that, plus 30%. So that's how you get 140 all in easily, times $280,000. Okay? Now, the other interesting thing is, so they say, well, you should hire these people so that you have a minimum of 5 on at all times. Okay? And they would like actually to have 6. But the answer is they say you have these, you will have more people. And that's true. If you hire more people, you'll always have more firefighters on staff. And they say these 2 people will reduce overtime. And frankly, that's probably true. The interesting thing, it's like the analogy I use is when my wife comes home and she says, guess what? I saved $100 today. Isn't that good news? And I go, yeah, but what did you spend to save the $100? She goes, well, there were sheets on sale at the Bay, and I spent $300, but I saved $100. Isn't this good news? Now, the analogy isn't perfect, but it's, you know, the answer is they're saying spend $280,000 to save on your overtime. And there would be overtime savings, but again, the challenge with overtime and staffing is it never lines up perfectly in terms of that. And so there's always overtime. And even if you have these 2 people, you're still going to have weeks of vacation that they're not going to be there. There's going to be 12 lieu days for them. There's going to be sick days. There's going to be WSIB days. There's going to be bereavement leave days. There's going to be jury leave duties. So you're not getting 100 or 200 or 182 days from each of these people as well. So, okay, I get it in terms of that. So we go back to the Act, which is where we started here. Under the Act, under the Fire Prevention, Protection and Prevention Act, which is the piece of legislation that governs labor relations in fire departments, it says a municipality shall, A, establish a program in the municipality which must include public education with respect to fire safety and certain components of fire prevention. So if you stop there, the only thing you're legally obliged to do as a municipality is actually to have public education in fire prevention. You don't even have to have a fire department. Okay, don't go there, don't even start thinking about that, okay? But the second part is B, and you shall provide such other fire protection services, that's broadly defined under the Act, as it determines, which means as you determine, you council determine, may be necessary in accordance with council's needs and circumstances. So just to step back, what that tells you is that under the FPPA, council decides the degree of fire protection services that are provided in Owen Sound in terms of your assessment of the needs and circumstances. Okay? That's your job. Now, the answer to that is you're the elected officials. You decide based on what the circumstances that you think the citizens want or don't want. You could go and say, we have a total volunteer fire department. That's what Inner Township has. The response time for Inner Township will be less than your response time here in the city of Owen Sound. Okay, it takes longer for volunteers to get their gear, get to the truck to the scene, etc. You don't have a guarantee as to how many are going to show up. In Owen Sound, we know right now that you're going to have 5 people that will always show up. We're suggesting we drop that number to 4. If you have volunteers, the cost is lower. But if you have fewer people, it's always not fewer, let me put it the other way around. More is always better than less, okay? In any fire department, it's better to have 5 firefighters show up than it is to have 4 firefighters show up. And frankly, when in Toronto, they need a firefighter to direct traffic of the tankers and the pumpers and the aerials that are showing up because they have so many resources, they have to line them up on the street in terms of that. Well, you're not going to do that here. You do not have the budget to do that, no disrespect in terms of the process, but you're not going to. Not at $140,000 per person. Okay? So you have to decide, based on your assessment of the needs and circumstances in this community, what you think is appropriate. So if you have more firefighters or fewer firefighters, that's your call. Now, the answer is, so someone will say, well, let's just pass a motion here and we'll go ahead and do that and make it happen. Well, you can't do that because in your collective agreement, people, well before I started doing your work, and frankly, I don't know when these clauses went in, but decades and decades ago, these minimum staffing numbers went in, and some well-intentioned people on council thought that was a good idea at the time. That's fair in terms of that, but they might not be fair today. And so the assessment has been done by your fire department in terms of saying, okay, we think that we can survive and provide for the needs and circumstances in our community with a minimum of 5 and not a minimum, sorry, with a minimum of 4 and not a minimum of 5. And we certainly oppose increasing the number of firefighters in the department from 26 to 28. Okay? So let me maybe pause there for just a second, take questions, and then Andy McDonald's going to come and talk about some of the things and just in terms of the impacts of changing from 5 to 4 with regard to the services you can actually operate in the community. So questions with regard to labor relations, the collective agreement, the bargaining strategy, all of those kinds of things.
Questions? John?
Thank you for this. And it may anticipate KCB's presentation. I was a bit disappointed in the KCB report because it did not say they recommended for, the language was, they said we can consider moving to 4.
Yeah.
And they were pressed on this at the last meeting where we dealt with this, and I was surprised by it. Does that hinder us? That what I find to be fairly weak language in the KCB report.
This is live TV, right? No. It asks for a recommendation. They recommend, and it's recommended to you. You make the decision. They're not going to tell you how to staff your report. If you ask any consultant or any expert in fire services, they will always say more is better. More is better. No question about that. The question is, what do you say fits the needs and circumstances in your community? What do you think is necessary in terms of satisfying the needs for the citizens of Owen Sound with regard to that? So they said recommendation. It's a recommendation to you with regard to, you can consider that as a recommendation. They didn't say, no, that's a dumb idea. They would not recommend that you do that. And you can certainly ask Andy that.
Questions, Mary?
Thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Lots of information there. They respond to an incident and
Yeah.
they take one truck and, as a proposed for firefighters, who stays with the truck, or do they have to stay with the truck, or
Well, it's a little more complicated. Like right now, we have 5 firefighters, and the dispatch protocol is that for something big, let's use the word big, all 3, they take 2 pumpers and an aerial. So they take 3 trucks. So 3 people go in the first pumper, 1 person takes the second pumper, 1 takes the aerial. Very few municipalities, in my experience, and the 2 gentlemen behind me can speak more to this than I, but nobody takes 3 trucks on a first response with just 5 people. Most would take just 2 trucks in terms of that. So if you only had 4 individuals, you would only take 2 trucks. But that's standard across the system with regard to that. And my assumption would be you should take 2 and 2. But it depends on what the incident is. If it's a medical response, 1 pumper is sent with 3 people and 2 stay back at the station. So waiting for a second call on something else. Okay?
Right?
Thanks. John, what does the association say about going from 5 to 4? Is it only hire 2 more, or are they saying it's unsafe to go from 5 to 4, or what are they saying?
Yeah, they're opposed to going from 5 to 4. They say it will increase risk for firefighters, and they say it will increase risk to the public and to property. And I'll give you my version, and then Andy can certainly talk about this in a much more informed perspective from his perspective. At the end of the day, the decision to do what needs to be done on a fire scene is made by the captain. The captain sits there in every set of circumstances and makes the assessment as to whether or not we put people into a fire scene or we leave people outside. You could have 20 firefighters there, and they could say, nobody is going inside, we're all staying outside and pouring water on the scene because I, the incident commander or captain, have decided that it's not safe for someone to go in there. And they're looking at, the list is 2 pages long. They're looking at, you know, how many staff do I have there, what resources do I have, what's the weather, what's the condition of the fire, what does the smoke look like, where's the fire, what are the combustibles, a whole series of factors that they have to decide on any given situation what they want to do. They weigh the risk and they make the determination. And I say that same risk determination or risk allocation is made whether there's 4, 5, or 6 firefighters there. The captain has to make that decision and decide, if I'm putting my people in unnecessary risk, it's his job to say, no, we will not do that. Firefighters absorb risk every day. That's part of their job. That's why they're paid what they're paid in terms of that. The captain has to decide whether it's an informed risk or not. We talk about 2 in, 2 out. So usually what you have is a situation where you can send 2 firefighters. When firefighters go into a building, they go in pairs. You don't go in by yourself. And so in a perfect world, you send 2 firefighters in, and you have 2 firefighters outside who can do rescue if those 2 firefighters get into trouble. In a perfect world, you have a 5th individual who's a pumper, who stays at the pumper and controls the water for that person. In a really perfect world, the person sits there, and there's a 6th person who's an incident commander. Now, let me just actually, if I might, Madam Clerk, just share this. There was an assessment that was made by the association's expert, Mr. Burke, while he was the fire marshal, and this was called the critical task matrix. And this critical task matrix, it's a little fuzzy, so I apologize for that. Some of you are going to have to get your high-level glasses out to look at this. What it does is it shows the various types of fireground critical tasks and how many people you actually need to conduct these. And so they base it whether it's a low, moderate, high, or extreme risk. So low risk is small buildings, small houses. Extreme risk is things like nuclear plants and, you know, hospitals and things of that nature. What you will see is that in a low risk type of situation, you can have a low efficiency, an LEFL, which is a low effective response level, or an upper effective response level. So if you look under each of the categories, you have an LERL and a UER. And again, this is probably way too much detail that I need to be getting into, but I slightly apologize, but not really. So this is what their expert says is appropriate to do various types of risk and how many firefighters you actually need. Well, what I can tell you is moderate risk under this is a single family dwelling? Yeah, so a single-family dwelling is a moderate-risk building. To do that, you need between 16 and 43 firefighters. The fifth guy won't matter a hill of beans. You need 16 according to this. And to get 43, you're getting everyone back from the city of Owen Sound, plus you're getting everyone from Inner Township. And if you get to the high risk where you need 83, which might be your hospital, you need 83 firefighters. You're getting them from the whole county and the next county over, okay, to get 83 firefighters. Okay, let's live in that real world. Okay, now, have you ever needed that? No. Never had that, and frankly, I can't think of a situation in Northern Ontario where that's happened. Now, if you go back to Toronto when they had the Racket Club fire, Matt Pegg, who was the Toronto fire chief, I don't know, he had a couple hundred firefighters out there, but he had the resources to do that, okay? Your situation, there will be property damage, okay? There could be loss of life. I asked these guys when we were coming in, does anyone remember a time when there's been a civilian loss of life in Owen Sound? And they said, well, I can't remember in the last 5 years. I don't know when there is, but that, and you should not be measuring the effectiveness of your department by whether you have civilian loss of life either, because the practical answer is that doesn't mean it's a failure of your fire department. Usually it means they didn't have a smoke detector in their house, frankly, or a working smoke detector. They had a smoke detector, the battery probably didn't work. I give this to you, though, to demonstrate that if you really want to effectively start fighting fires, according to the association's expert, you need to be looking at doubling or tripling the size of your fire department. And practically, you're just not going to do that. And if you were to do that, what you'd be doing is you'd be looking at volunteers. Okay? And we're not here tonight to talk about volunteers, because I know someone's going to say, well, why don't we just get a whole bunch of volunteers? That's a different story. You have contracting out language. We're not proposing to change that in this round of bargaining. Just let that go. So 5 is better than 4. But if you need the 5th, you need 16 or 43. Can 5 do more than 4? Sure. Okay, response might be a little slower. Would there be situations where you might not be going in as quickly with 4 as opposed to 5? Yes, that could occur. And the answer to that is, in terms of firefighter safety, the captain needs to make that assessment, weighing that fact in the balance. The captain knows I only have 4 people. So let's just talk practically. If you come onto a building and there's someone lying 1 foot inside the door, the reality is, I don't care how many people they have, they're going to grab the person 1 foot inside the door. If they're 5 feet inside the door, they're going in to grab the person 5 feet inside the door. If they look down the long hall of a center hall house and they see the fire all around the arches of the front door, maybe not. And they're going to have to make a decision. The captain will make a decision based on what is an effective, safe level of risk for his staff and the circumstances that he has. And that's the decision. We would support whatever decision he made, whether he says go in or not. And that's the way that these things work. Okay?
So just getting back to my original question then, just to forget about all these other numbers and let's just look at what our firefighters say and what our firefighters do. So, because I want to understand where they're coming from too.
Well, sorry, if I could just pause on that.
Yeah.
We asked them to come tonight to present. We asked them either as the association, their lawyer, or their expert to come, and regretfully they declined.
Right.
So I'm a little hesitant to speak on their behalf, but I will try.
Right. So when you answer my question, one of the things you said is the association saying going from 5 to 4 is a risk to the public.
Right.
So earlier on you said 75% of our firefighters live outside the city.
Correct.
So these firefighters, if they're working the night shift in Owen Sound, they're getting into bed in the Owen Sound Fire Department, and their wife and kids are in a house in Georgian Bluffs or whatever, and the fire department that's protecting his wife and children has 0 firefighters in that fire station. So I just wonder, where does that rate in terms of being safe?
I think it speaks for itself. I can't disagree with that logic. If the firefighters thought that it was unsafe for their wife and children, I would have thought they would not live outside the city of Owen Sound. Now, maybe they will say, no, I have a working smoke detector on every level of my house. I have a working smoke detector in the every bedroom. I have a ABC fire extinguisher under every bed, and I've done everything I possibly. I have a sprinkler system in the house. So therefore, I have protected my family in an appropriate manner. But the reality is, I think it's an interesting observation that speaks for itself.
Right. I think, well, common sense says that we're pretty safe if we go from 5 to 4. With the ability.
I agree.
Thanks.
In your experience, have you worked with any other councils where they've had to make this kind of decision?
You are the first to make this type of decision. Councils have made lots of other decisions. Let me just throw out different scenarios. The town of Deep River had a situation where they had more full-timers, and they wanted to change the full-timers and replace them. Actually, no, sorry, we did this in Deep River. We decreased the number of full-timers and increased the number of volunteers. And we had an interest arbitrator award that because of the circumstances in that community. It is not something which frequently happens, and I'll tell you why it's different in Owen Sound. Your population is not growing. So if you look back statistically over your population you will know better than I, certainly over the last 5 years it hasn't grown. I don't think it has in the last 10 years. If you're looking at Vaughan, Brampton, Mississauga, and a number of the GTA-ish areas, all of those departments are growing. It's only once you get outside sort of Barrie and north, excluding Sudbury, that the municipalities are static. And so therefore the question is, do we need the resources that we have? What you need to appreciate, though, is if you go back to the chart that we handed out at the start, you are at the higher end right now in terms of the resources that you are providing. So the other municipalities don't have to make these decisions because they don't have the same degree of resources that you do have. They have not expanded historically to where you are. Frankly, you're trying to decrease to where they are with regard to that.
Through your worship. So help me understand.
Okay?
I'm sitting here as a new councillor. What you're proposing is that this council needs to make a decision, and the decision is, are we going to be changing the fire service delivery model by going from a staffing of 5 to 4?
Correct.
And as a new councillor then, if we make that decision, I am assuming that the skills of the captain are the ones who operationalize this. Where is the liability as a council if we make the decision to go from 5 to 4?
Well, ultimately, it rests in the insurance company. But the answer is, and I'm sure I defer to Michael in terms of this, but you have fully trained, competent captains. These are people who have gone through the training, and we continue to train them. I don't know if you want to talk about the training with regard to that, but
I think John's explained it very well in terms of the reliance that we put on the captains. And I'll just say that from my perspective, even as an outsider when I came here, the captains that we have here in Owen Sound are well trained, they're experienced and very knowledgeable. So I trust those captains to make that decision to keep our people safe, as I do today, as I would if we changed and reduced the staffing or the original minimum staffing to 4. I trust them to do that.
So we basically, as a council, have a governance issue to decide, and we need to ensure that the operational aspects are taken care of by those with the skills and expertise to do that. Correct?
yes.
We're counting on you to operationalize any decision that we make.
Just before you go forward, I want to clarify maybe with Wayne. Did the last council not make this decision?
You supported the recommendations of the KCB report. Yes, you did.
So in fact, what we're going to be looking at is not making the decision for the first time. We're going to be confirming council's previous decision. So it's not like this is the first time ever, just so we're clear.
Actually, sorry, and Your Worship, you're exactly right, and I apologize. I should have mentioned that at the front. And this is the second time, and the reason we're here before you tonight is we have substantially more information. Before, it was more theoretical, if I can put it that way. Now it's much more practical in terms of this. Now, to be fair, the standard operating procedures, and there's a whole pile of them that the firefighters work under, some of those might have to be changed or tweaked to operationalize the model. It's not, what is drafted today is not going to fit 100%. There would have to be, under the guidance of the chief and the deputy, the captains, they would all work together and say, okay, we need to change the language on this because we're going to do this a little differently here. There's no doubt about that.
I'd just like to go back to one of your earliest comments on the issue of council being the one to decide the level of service we provide in our community.
Yeah.
And while that may be true in theory, I think that in reality we all know in the past that it's not been true at all. And I wonder if you could comment, first of all, on that, and then maybe give us a word on your feelings and the changes the province has brought into the interest arbitration system and what you might anticipate.
Okay, you could wind me up for an hour on this, but anyway, so just quickly, with regard to your first question, sorry, what was your first question? I can't even remember now.
It's not really true that the municipality
sorry.
can just decide what kind of service it wants to offer.
No, exactly. Regretfully, in your situation, previous councils and/or HR departments and/or fire administration have baked into your fire collective agreement numerical guarantees as to the level of service, and the only way you can change those is to arbitrate them out. As I said at the start, the association will never agree to do that. The second question, though, is fascinating because I work with AMO, I work with Marco, Lumco, Clerks and Treasurers, and OMRA, and the Ontario Fire Chiefs Association, all of the municipal organizations, and I've been doing this for 32 years. We have been lobbying the provincial government for an extended period of time. And I don't think that there's any doubt that on a historic basis, the Ontario Professional Firefighters Association, the umbrella organization that represents the fire associations across this province, have been a very effective lobby group. And in particular, when the Liberals were in power, they and the Liberals were one very strong body. And the Liberals, they worked tirelessly in support of the Liberal candidates across this province. And in fairness, and quite appropriately, the Liberals paid them back. And I'm not sure that's the right phrase, but that is the reality. The current Tory government does not have that same relationship with the Fire Association. And so recently they passed changes to the Fire Prevention and Protection Act. Regretfully, those changes do not apply to this interest arbitration because it's under the old regime. I would love it to be under the new regime. Part of me actually considered saying, oh, just collapse it and we'll run it through under the new regime. But we're so far into this, I don't really want to do that. But there is fundamental changes in the criteria that the arbitrators have to look at in terms of determining the terms and conditions of employment for your firefighters. And just to indulge me for 30 seconds, one of the largest ones is with regard to wages. So historically, arbitrators would only look at police and other fire departments. And so the problem was that in a municipality exactly like Owen Sound, you would go out and you would negotiate twosies with CUPE, twosies for wage increases with all of your senior staff, and you would give 3% to the firefighters and 3% to the cops. And that went on for years and years and years, such that the salary compression that exists is that your fire chief is being paid money that has been increased at 2% per year, and the people in the bargaining unit have been getting wage increases that have gone up at 3% plus per year. And so the salary compression that exists between your fire chief and your deputy fire chief and the senior person in the bargaining unit who's making $140 all in plus $181,000 of overtime spread amongst a bunch of them, they're being paid more than your management. And frankly, they're not paying me to say this, but that's a problem. Okay, that's a story for another day, and please take care of that. But you have this huge salary compression issue that exists between fire management and other senior management and people within that bargaining unit. Hopefully, the change to the Act says that the interest arbitrators have to consider bargain results that came out of bargaining units under the Labor Relations Act, like CUPE. So that now the interest arbitrators have to consider what CUPE got. So we'll be able to go and say, look, CUPE got, I don't know what you gave CUPE, 1.5? Yeah, 1.5, 1.5, 1.5. No fire department is getting 1.5, 1.5, 1.5. They're all getting way more than that. So it makes our job way easier, or at least hopefully easier, when we can show and say, look, every CUPE employee in the city of Owen Sound got 1.5 for 3 years. Management got 1.5 for 3 years. All the other non-union staff got 1.5% for 3 years. Why should the firefighters be paid any differently than anyone else in the city of Owen Sound, supported by the same tax dollars, especially when their job didn't change from last year? Okay? And there's a bunch of other positive changes. But yeah, it is a different world under this, and it's going to be way faster. You'll love it because it's way cheaper. There's no nominees. It's way faster, way more efficient. A bunch of stuff that the municipalities, and I have to give a shout out to the OMRON, the AMO, and the Fire Chiefs Association, who've been lobbying for this for an extended period of time. They received what they'd asked for. Now we have to actually do something with it. But
Go to Scott.
Thanks, Rabbi, and thanks, John, for the presentation here tonight. I supported the motion that the last council made, and I still believe it favorable to advance that. I have a question that popped up, and as a result of something you said. It was a question I was going to ask Mr. Burke if he was here tonight presenting. But you'd mentioned we were the only municipality to look at this this minimum staffing. And I know I spoke to a municipal official from North Bay.
Yeah.
They went through this in 2015. They had Mr. Burke presented to North Bay Council.
yeah,
They were looking at going from 16 to a minimum of staffing of 13, spread over 3 fire departments in the municipality. They have a 4th, but it's not staffed. So they've got 3 staff departments, and they did move forward on that.
yeah.
They are at 13. So when you said tonight we were the first one to be looking at it, I was kind of surprised. Knowing that North Bay has successfully implemented it, I wondered if the difference was because ours is embedded in contract law and theirs
Correct.
was not.
Yeah, I don't believe the North Bay was in their collective agreement.
Okay.
And I'm not sure they haven't started those changes, gone backwards on those. It's in flux, let's just put it that way, in North Bay. But no, that's your difference. Because again, if you go back to the little minimum staffing chart, you'll see that most people don't have it embedded in. So to your point, if it's not embedded in, council can just raise their hand now and say 4, 15 to 13, done. And it just happens. And there's no recourse from a legal point of view for the association. Fundamentally different rules. I wish that was the way it was here, regretfully. So yeah, good observation.
Just before I go back to John and Brian for a second round, I had a quick question. You're talking about second alarm, you're calling in the other 5 from the night shift or the day shift, the other side of the platoon. We've also got a trainer that's there full-time. We've got
2 fire prevention.
fire prevention. When there's a second alarm, do they come and fight fires? Do their boots go on? How does that work?
I'll leave that to...
They do come to the call, more typically on a 3rd alarm, just because then we have a confirmed fire. So they do take other rules, though. So, for instance, a training officer takes a safety officer rule. Quite often, fire prevention will liaise with the citizens or whatever, or the people being evacuated. So they have a role, but they're not actively fighting the fire.
Okay. Good, thank you. That was my question. Thank you.
But just to follow up on that, those are roles that if you didn't have those people there, suppression firefighters would be performing
Would
those
have
tasks.
to, okay, would have
So,
to.
so it's an additional body that takes the weight off the suppression firefighters.
Let's in focus.
Yeah.
Okay, good, thank you. John, you had a follow-up? No? Brian, you had a follow-up?
I did. John, I had these, I wrote these down. I know you gave us a sheet. I think there's 12 here. Stouffville, Georgina, Orangeville, East Gромbury, Amherstburg, Collingwood, Sega Beach, Cobourg, Colburn, Midland, Kenora, and Pembroke all had less than 5 at their starting point.
Yeah.
So just on the reverse of this, do you have any evidence or data that in any of these places that are less than 5, that there's taxpayers lining up, pounding their fists on the table saying that we feel unsafe? Or is there other associations in these municipalities that are going to arbitration saying we should have more firefighters? Like, are they fighting it the other way to try and get it up to 5?
I can tell you, I'm not aware of any situations where there's citizens pounding their fists on the table. Again, every municipality has a small lobby group for every
Sure.
issue, but am I aware of mass revolt amongst the citizens? No.
But what about associations or unions that are they going to arbitration saying, you know, we only have 3 firefighters in our department, we want to go to 4?
No.
We want to go to 5?
The only place, right now I'm doing one for the city of Greater Sudbury, and they're saying that they would like to have an additional 2 full-time firefighters in one of their current composite departments. So Sudbury is a composite municipality, and when the city of Greater Sudbury was formed, it used to have the old city of Sudbury that had full-timers, and then there was volunteers in the surrounding communities. And again, there's a long story, but there's one, I think it's Valley East, that's there's one station that now I think has 2 full-timers, and they are saying, no, we'd like to have 4 full-timers in there, and we're going to be litigating that in August and September of this year.
Right.
But other than that, there are a couple of other municipalities that are litigating to do the exact same type of thing, slightly different. Brockville is litigating to try and use what they call casual firefighters, where instead of having full-time people, what they would like to be able to do is to say, we'd have like part-time people are on call, so that if you go on vacation for a week, I'll bring somebody in and say, okay, we'll pay you as a full-time firefighter to cover off Brian's 1 week worth of vacation. But when he comes back,
but they're stuck at 5.
but they're stuck, yeah.
The same as we are. But
Yeah.
I think that's pretty telling. So I'm talking
Yeah.
about the ones that are below us.
No.
That they're not screaming
No.
to get up to 4, or get up to 3, or...
No, I think
I
could
think
tell
that's
you
telling
that
as well.
at least one of them, I think Innisfil is planning on increasing the number, but that's an initiative that council has brought forward. And some of them, I can tell you, for example, East Gwillimbury, for example, has increased their number. But again, that's an initiative, frankly, of the chief, because they're in communities that are growing, and so when they build huge new subdivisions, they have to go and say, well, let's put a station in the new subdivision. That's not your fact situation. So if you're looking at municipalities that are static, no. Brockville is like you, they're going to arbitration, and they're trying to decrease some of their manning provisions. So it's certainly, people are not doing the opposite of what we're suggesting here.
John, just for your information, our Twin City of Brockville, former Mayor David Henderson attended with us at AMO conference. Good road? No, AMO conference last summer to meet the Minister of Labor on this issue. So we've worked together as much as we can with them.
Yeah, they're certainly on the same ilk as you are.
So those are the questions. Oh, one more, Marion, for John?
Yes, thank you. Under the Brockville model, they have 2 stations, but it's 5 suppression firefighters. How many at each station, or is there 5 at each station?
No, it's 3 at one, 2 at the other. It's 5 in total.
Thanks.
Okay, and it's the same thing if you look at Stratford on the first page. Go down to the third one. So Innisfil has 6, but it's 3 per station, so 2 stations. And I think Stratford's 3 and 3 as well. Aurelia, I know, is 3 and 4, so they have 7 firefighters, but they have 3 in one station, 4 in the other station. So they're not over 5 in one station.
Sault Ste. Marie went to 3 a couple of years ago per station.
Yeah, but
It's still up in the air.
yeah, they've been up and down. Mr. Burke was there as well. They've had some toings and froings.
So Mr. Burke is the letter that you're referring to that we had received with our package.
Yes.
And he acts for the associations as their...
Yes, he is retained almost exclusively by fire associations. The phrase one might, I like, and in fairness, I'm retained exclusively by management side, but I'm an advocate, I'm a lawyer, I'm not an independent expert. Mr. McDonald, who you're going to hear from, he's written stuff that the associations have praised. So when he did the Calgary stuff, the Fire Association was in support of what you wrote out there, as was the department. So there is a difference between, you know, sort of quote, some types of experts where they only go for one side. Some might consider that bias, others would say, well, I just always see the facts lining up a certain way.
Good,
in
okay,
terms of that.
thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think we do need to certainly hear from
Andy, yeah.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, John. And you left very little to say. But I will talk about, first of all, I'm not repeating the presentation that I did last summer on our report. Thank you very much for brevity and for the fact I'm virtually a last-minute addition to tonight's proceedings. I thank you for the opportunity to be here to talk about it and to answer your question, Councillor Tamming, with regards to I guess the intensity of our recommendation. First thing I'm going to start with is the fact that the RFP asked us to provide an analysis of the Owen Sound Fire and Emergency Services operations and was also to consider the efficacy of the current staffing levels. And in looking at staffing levels in this province and in fact across the country, the challenge is there is no legislation, there are no regulations, and there are no individual statutes where it comes to staffing. That's probably the only point that John didn't make. There is nothing to follow other than some well-accepted guidelines and standards, most of them not established here in Ontario or in Canada, although under the NFPA, which is arguably an international body. So in answering the question around the efficacy and getting to your concern, Councillor Tamming, I heard the word common sense mentioned here a couple of times tonight, and in our very first meeting with regards to writing this report, common sense states that 5 is better than 4, 6 is better than 5, 7 is better than 6. It would be irresponsible to suggest that a lower number of respondents to a fire would be as safe as 5. 3 is less safe than 4, 2 is less safe than 3, et cetera, to the point where you have nobody responding or using a different delivery model, such as volunteers. So our challenge was to look at the efficacy of the current model, and when questioned about whether or not 4 would be a viable change, you have to mention that it's not as effective, and then try to measure in the form of the report looking at NFPA standard 1710, which applies to a professional fire service, the Ontario Section 21 Committee on Safety and the guidelines under Section 21, under the Occupational Health and Safety Association, and under the SOPs of the Owen Sound Fire and Emergency Services. Looking at, and then also accepted practices across the country. In my experience, certainly in working in this new industry, has led me to research. And putting all of that together, the object of the report, or the recommendation in the report, was to look at, recommended you can go down to 4. Like I said, it would be irresponsible to say it's as safe, because it's not. But what are the risks? Are they legitimate risks? Are they risks that would make it an improbable change? Or are they risks that, as City Council, because as John so eloquently mentioned, it's your responsibility to set the level of service. Is it a risk, or are they risks that you're willing to accept? So the report went into great detail under the different accepted standards and current practices to point out what's the difference between 5 and 4. And essentially, without getting into a tremendous amount of detail again, the difference is in 1710, the Section 21, Occupational Health and Safety, the simple way to look at it, they want 4 firefighters on the scene, they want 2 in and 2 out. That 5th person is running the pump to making sure that those firefighters have water. There's other things to be taken into consideration. There's incident command. We talked about mobile command, or John did, and the fact that a captain is going to be going into the fire. But the key is to have 2 people on the outside under all of those standards to be able to go in and effect a rescue if something happens to those first 2 firefighters when they go into the building. Somebody needs to be on the outside, and this comes down to my opinion and expertise, to make sure that there's water for them when they go into the building, and that's your pump operator. So effectively, or practically speaking, here in Owen Sound, responding with 5 firefighters on that first truck, when they show up in the scene, if the captain, Councillor Merton asked about the effectiveness and the training of the captain, if the captain, the knowledgeable, well-trained captain, looks at the scene and figures it's worth the risk, that the reward is worth the risk, that it's safe to go into that building and effect a rescue, because it's all about rescue. We want to get the people out. Building is certainly not as important as it is getting those people outside. If the captain determines that it's safe enough to enter, the risk is less than the reward to make that rescue, he can go in, and knowing that he's got 2 firefighters on the outside that can come in as a rapid intervention team to pull them out if something goes wrong. 4 firefighters pull up on the scene, and again, I'm simplifying it to some extent. The captain, looking at the situation and weighing the risks and the potential reward of being able to go in and rescue, will be, it's not as easy, or there's more risk taken in going in with 2 firefighters without having that RIT team on the outside to go in and effect that rescue. Now, the report goes into the numbers, and John, certainly, the graphs tonight showed how many actual fires there are in Owen Sound on average in any given year. Again, I don't have a crystal ball any more than he does to be able to tell you that these are the number of times that the citizens that may or may not be in that building are at greater risk. But the numbers here are quite low. You don't get a lot of fires in a year. And then you also have to take into account that when, in the recommendation to go down from 5 to 4, we looked at minimum staffing of 4. So that doesn't mean every day across the board, every truck's gonna, or that first truck's going to respond with 4. That means on the days when the WSIB, LTD, STD, sick, some firefighters are assigned to college, for instance, training. John went over the more common reasons why people aren't there. On those days when it gets down to 4, you'll only have 4 responding. So if I can summarize what it said under the recommendations, and I'm going to read this because you may not all have our report in front of you. It says, it talks about the, in 2017, and that's the data we had. The report was written last summer, in May and June. That said that the overtime in 2017, as you saw earlier, was a cost of approximately $186,000. That represents approximately 29% of all shifts. There was 29% of the time that overtime had to be called in to upstaff to the number of 5. The best estimate of future needs is to look at past performance. Therefore, if the need for backfilling to maintain 5 on duty is at 29%, to go to minimum staffing level of 4 will be to accept the risk that the first responding crews will not be able to perform rescue duties upon arrival at just under 1/3 of all calls. So that was the summary. Again, it wasn't our position. It would be, I believe, irresponsible for me to say to you, go to 4. It's not my decision. My responsibility was to tell you what the consequences may be and the added risk to making that change.
Thank you. The situation you described of attending a fire and rescue was involved, would there not be 2 platoons there anyways? Wouldn't it be a second alarm situation?
Yeah, that difference is waiting for that. If there was 4 to respond instead of 5, would be waiting for that 5th person. So the call is, when the call is dispatched, it's up to the responding captain to make the decision whether or not to call in that second alarm. So there's a time gap there. So typically they're, based on the information they're given, and it may be the fact that they pull out of the station and can see the smoke in the distance, or it may be added information. The dispatcher may say, we're getting added calls on this. In other words, that this is a fire. Then the captain would call in the second alarm. So there's typically a gap between when the first alarm is dispatched and the second, and then there's the added time for that second alarm crew to respond from home or the hockey arena or wherever they may be in a reasonable amount of time. So it's the time it takes to get that 5th person there if you were to go to a 4 crew model.
So can I ask the deputy chief then to explain to us the magnitude of an incident that you would call the second alarm in?
Through you. A typical call where they would call a second alarm is when the captain's on the way and they hear from dispatch something to the nature of there's smoke in the building, so it sounds like it's a confirmed fire, they would call a second alarm.
And that's after the first platoon's already there?
No. Again, through your worship. So on the way, so typically what would happen is the dispatch is coming, information is being given, something like there's, you know, maybe that there's smoke in the building and they're dispatched to a location. They get on the truck, they're on the way. They would say, just to confirm that there is actual smoke in the building, yes there is, dispatch a second alarm.
Just want to clarify something, Mr. McDonald, that you said. So in view of the fact that you know, the recommendation here is for a minimum of 4, you know, this scenario may not occur at all. I mean, I'm not asking you to predict the future, but there may or may not be 4. There may be 5 responding, and we can't know that.
That's correct. So
Okay.
this is a minimum of 4. It's not to reduce staffing, my understanding, to 4 all the time. It's just not calling in that 5th person in the days when you have 4 show up for duty.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Andy, when you're talking about the captain weighing the risk, he's weighing that risk whether there's 4 firefighters or 5, right?
Yes, based
So-
on the scene,
Right.
what
So-
they see.
Right, so that number doesn't matter then. The other thing is, you use the word irresponsible. It's irresponsible, what did you say? Going from 5 to 4.
To tell you to go to 4 without outlining the risks, the added risk, because 4 is not as, 4, there's some built-in risks as opposed to 5, and as you go down, it gets less, and the more you add, it becomes better.
Yeah.
You're on a spot right now of 5, and the question was posed to us, what would the change to 4 look like? So it's the responsible to point out what the difference would be in having 4 respond as opposed to 5.
Okay. Because when we're looking at the numbers, really 0 is safe. Based on what I said before, like our own firefighters have their own families in their homes, counting on a fire department that has 0 firefighters in it. So 0 is safe. Like we know that these guys aren't leaving their family at high risk. So 0 is safe. So I just want to make that point because going from 5 to 4 is just as responsible, I would think, just to stick with that number. I also have a question for Mike, if I could. I know exactly where the chief stands. Where do you stand with this? Do you think this is sufficient to go from 5 to 4?
Throughout the province, the typical response on the first crew arriving is 4. That's the typical norm. So it's a little more unusual here that we have 5. I'm going to put it in perspective. Maybe this will kind of give you some degree of comfort. If I look back to where I came from, where Andy and I came from, Brampton. So when I left, there were 18 crews there. There was 5 two-truck stations, what we call two-truck, 2 crews, and 8 one-truck stations. So those one-truck stations tend to be on the periphery. So in the days when Andy and I were captains, as an example, when we would arrive, we would typically be arriving with 4 people on the truck. And back in those days, you certainly could expect to be minutes before the subsequent trucks would arrive. In that time, with those 4 people, you're going to make that decision whether you're going to go in or not. You don't expect to have 5, you expect to typically have 4.
Right.
The difference here in Owen Sound versus a department like that was just how many people were coming behind you. But when you have that initial 4, it wasn't any different. Okay, so the difference here versus when we were back then is just what was coming behind us. But when you're initially arriving and making the decision whether you're going to go in or take action, it's exactly the same situation.
Right. So you're okay with 4.
Yeah.
And you've already mentioned that you already know before you even get to the fire if you're calling a second alarm. So So the second alarm, they're right on your heels.
Yeah. I'll make another point too, is I can tell you that the firefighters in Owen Sound, they take great pride, and they constantly tell me about of keeping the fires to the room of origin. They take great pride in that. They think often they don't get the kind of the recognition that they should have because it doesn't turn into a big inferno. So, but I can tell you that they take great pride in that, and I believe that going forward, regardless of what changes we might make, that's not going to change. They're an aggressive department. They're going to go in, and they're going to continue to keep those fires to the single room.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. And now might be a good time to mention, too, that I don't think anyone on this panel has ever said a bad thing about our fire department. I think when they're fighting fires, we have the best fire department. We don't complain about the money they make. That's not what we're doing. We're just trying to make a responsible decision here in our manning numbers, and we think we have a great fire department. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
John Tammy, go ahead.
I don't mean to press this, but I'm going to one more time. I find it odd that as a consultant, we retained you to talk about risk. And I have to admit, I find it odd that you can't make a recommendation as to whether or not moving to 4 falls within your professional opinion within acceptable risk. We have a videographer, 2 lawyers, a few retailers. You're the expert, and I'm just wondering why you can't make that call. I appreciate we make the decision, but surely you can advise us whether you think it falls within acceptable risk. That would help us immeasurably, I think, in our deliberations.
Yes, and that was the report. It falls within acceptable risks. But just-
Good. Anyone else? Seeing none. So, conclusion time? Wrap-up time? I've just, from my point of view, the things that I've heard tonight, first of all, I want to go back to Mr. McDonald's report that came in the summer, and the recommendations, the first word in each one is to consider. So it recognizes that the duty is on us to make the decision. The report was consider this, consider that, and I think the report basically told us what we should consider, but it was up to us to consider it, so I get that. Really big point, and I didn't pick up on it quickly enough. Mr. Saunders was going through as he talked about now we'll have 4, 5, or 6 there. Mr. McDonald hit on that. We're not talking about 4 all the time. We're talking about if we've got enough people off that are ill on different leaves and we can't get 5, that we can drop to 4, which will be probably a minimal number of occasions, but it's going to save us in the overtime and start to cut down on the overtime costs that we're paying just to bring in to make sure that we're filling those 5 positions. So a lot of our overtime is to fill the 5 positions. It's not to come in for fires. It's not to come in for third alarms. It's mostly to fill those 5 positions that it's been adding up. So I think that's a really important part, and I'm glad you hit on that. Anyone else? Go ahead.
I have a prepared motion, Your Worship.
Sorry, Your Worship, if I might just add one comment.
If you want to come up to the microphone, Mr. Saunders, and then everybody at home will hear.
I am not retained by the association on this, but I think it would be, I would be remiss if I didn't attempt at least to point out some of the factors that were in Mr. Burke's report so that council can say that you've considered everything on both sides. It's, as I said initially, it's unfortunate they are not present here today to present on this, and I don't want someone to say, well, you just heard one side of the discussion. And so I'm happy to just, with your indulgence, to spend just a couple of minutes and point out a couple of issues that Mr. Burke put in his report, and I can say my comments on them, just so that everyone on council can feel that you've had a full airing of both sides. And again, I am not speaking on behalf of the association, and I'm sure they will say I didn't do a very good job in representing their report, but I'd just like to add a couple of points.
Just to confirm on the record, we did receive that report, all of us, and we had every opportunity. Everyone did read it, but go ahead.
Okay, so maybe let me just raise a couple points, and then if anyone has questions, on the Burke report, I'm happy to attempt to address them as best as I can. I just want to make sure that council feels and has been properly informed, and I appreciate that you've had the opportunity to read that. Mr. Burke's report points out at page 14 at the top that there are some U.S. studies that talk about the fact that as you get smaller crews, that it takes longer to perform various functions. Well, I think that's an obvious response. The study that he quotes from is a study that was done in the States on 13-story buildings. You don't have 13-story buildings. The tallest in Owen Sound is 8. These buildings that were done on were not sprinklered. Your buildings, your 8-story buildings are sprinkled, and they also have fire separation in them. Those buildings did not have fire separation. And it mentioned that it took the 4-person crews 9 minutes longer than 5-person crews to perform 14 certain critical tasks. Also, it's my understanding that those individuals didn't have backup coming, which you have in terms of if they're doing all these types of factors. If there's a fire, you have those standby people who are coming to provide assistance, and they would certainly be there in shorter, hopefully, than 9 minutes. The response times that we have on a historic basis are less than that. Second of all, he talks about the issues that Mr. McDonald talked about having two firefighters go in and 2 outside. I think it is important to realize, though, that the 2 firefighters that are outside on the RIT team, which is the Rapid Intervention Team, their purpose is there for firefighter safety, not for the safety of the residents or the public, okay? They are only there to provide protection to the firefighters. So the reality is, if the firefighters can't go into, it's not safe for the firefighters, they should not be going in the first place. The captain should be making that decision, that if I don't have a full RIT team and I want a full RIT team, I shouldn't be putting my people in. That's a decision that the captain should be making in that scenario. And he emphasizes the comment that Mr. McDonald raised, that every firefighter counts. I think that's, we all agree with that. And that they might have to wait until a 5th firefighter arrived before they do some forms of interior attack. And that in Owen Sound, the urban core is made up largely of older building stock, and the proximity of buildings to one another in the core leads to a potential of rapid fire spread when response times are delayed. I think that that's true as well. His conclusion was that, in his opinion, increasing the complement from 26 to 28 would provide an increased safety for the on-duty responding firefighters by having an availability of 6 firefighters for most shifts. And that, in his opinion, the reduction from 5 on-duty firefighters to 4 on-duty firefighters would have a negative impact on the safety of the firefighters on the initial response. So, and if anyone has any questions with regard to his report, one of the 3 of us, I'm sure, would be happy to attempt to answer those.
They kind of contradict themselves on page 16 and 17. They're talking about the pump operator must stay with the pumper to monitor water flow and cannot be assigned to other duties, such as rescue or IRIC. And then in the very next page, well, it's SOG standards. So I don't know if they're different. It says the operator may act as one of the 4 assembled to effect a rescue.
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite understand that. Right now, well, maybe Mike can respond to that better in terms of the role that the pump operator might have or might
but
not
whoever's operating the pump or watching the water flow or whatever can act in a rescue, or
Yes,
I'm assuming.
and through your worship, that exact question was put to OSHA, which is, of course, down in the States, to the director of OSHA back in '98. So I have the letter with me. And they asked whether specifically you could use the pump operator in that function, and the director at the time, Director Miles, said that yes, you could.
Okay. Thanks.
Anyone else, any questions? Seeing none.
Okay, thank you.
Good, thanks. Thanks to all of you. And again, I repeat Brian's comments that we've seen some great work out of our fire departments over the last few years. You go back to the morning of the arson and saving the coach It was a huge night downtown building, and we've got the most confidence in our firefighters and their commitment, their pride, their abilities, and this isn't what this is about. So I repeat what Councillor or Deputy Mayor O'Leary said. Go ahead.
Thank you. I have a prepared motion. The City of Owen Sound has highly trained full-time professional firefighters supported by an in-house full-time training officer and equipped with state-of-the-art firefighting apparatus. The fire hall is staffed 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year. The city taxpayer has invested heavily in suppression capabilities and in proactively working to prevent fires from starting. These proactive efforts include community education, a full-time community safety officer, and a full-time fire inspection officer. Building code improvements in the past several decades with increased emphasis on fire retardant building materials, sprinkler systems, fire monitoring, and smoking alarms are having the desired effect of fewer calls for fire suppression services. Ignoring all of these facts and continuing to staff the fire hall as we did for decades past is not in the best interest of today's taxpayer. Times have changed. I am aware that when the fire department arrives with 4 firefighters and not 5, there will be some reductions in the service while the second alarm arrives. However, based on all the information, I have concluded that a minimum staffing of 4 is sufficient for Owen Sound. As I campaigned last fall, I heard over and over again that having a minimum staffing of 4 full-time professional firefighters on duty at all times was a level of service taxpayers would not only accept, but in fact expected. With that, Your Worship, I put forward my motion that City Council endorse recommendation number 1 in the KCB Owen Sound Fire Services Assessment Report to reduce the minimum on-duty suppression staffing from 5 to 4. I also encourage the fire chief and deputy to work with our neighbors and partners to achieve as many of the other recommendations in the KCB report as possible.
Thank you. So we have a motion on the floor. Discussion of the motion.
I would also ask for a recorded vote, please.
Okay. Discussion of the motion. Go ahead.
I'll be supporting the motion, but I do want to make it clear for the record that during the campaign, I never heard anyone say that we need 35 people in that office or in that building. I heard people saying we need a hybrid or a composite force yesterday, and I did not hear people say that $144,000 per person was fair compensation. Those are different issues for different times, and again, I'm going to support the motion. But it's my hope, through our very capable council, that under the new changes to the Arbitration Act, that we can actually take a run at composite at a later date. But I will be supporting the motion.
Anyone else? Any comments? Councillor Thomas?
I'll support the motion as well. I was confident the last time we voted on this that it was the right course, and I am still confident that this is the right course to take. I had a whole page of prepared remarks that I made earlier today, and I don't think that I can add to anything that we've heard here tonight. You know, the issue has nothing to do with the competence or the skill of our firefighters. The issue at this table specifically is money. We need the ability to choose the service that we believe we can afford that still protects our citizens. And we have not for a long time been in a position to do that. This council is now dealing with it. The last council dealt with it. The council before that dealt with it. And you could go back a long way that this has been an issue that has been on the table. And I heartily agree that it's time to try to get some results. And I just want to observe as well that while we're here talking about fire tonight, we did pass a motion at our last council meeting to reach out to our other municipal partners to talk about policing. It is, in my view, the cost of emergency services that is hobbling this community at present, and with almost 50% of our budget going to 2 departments. And so, you know, I just want to point out that we're not strictly focusing on fire, that we're looking at many things. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, so on a poll.
Councillor Dodd?
In favor?
Councillor Gregg?
In favor.
Councillor Hamley?
In favor.
Councillor Kepke?
In favor.
Councillor Merton?
In favor.
Councillor Tamming?
In favor?
Counselor Thomas,
In favor?
Deputy Mayor O'Leary,
In favor.
Mayor Body.
In favor?
Resolution is carried with 9 in favor and 0 opposed.
So next, I think on our agenda is number 5 is a motion that the committee rise.
Moved by myself, Councillor Gregg, that the Committee of the Whole rise and report.
All in favor? That is carried. Formal session.
Moved by myself, Councillor Gregg, seconded by Councillor Kepke, that the action taken in Committee of the Whole and considering staff presentations related to fire arbitration be confirmed by this council.
All in favor? That is carried. We have one bylaw being the confirmation of proceedings for tonight. Go ahead.
Moved by myself, Councillor Gregg, seconded by Councillor Tamming, that bylaw number 2019-032 be passed and enacted.
All in favor? And that is carried. So looking at the clock, it's 8:46. That concludes our business for tonight. We're adjourned. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for the presenters for coming.